Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian, where the world of literature meets the art of the kitchen. I'm Xavier, and today we have a truly special episode prepared for you. Coming up, our host Dean Jones sits down with a guest whose influence on the world of pastry is nothing short of legendary. For years, she served as the chief pastry recipe developer for the Ottolenghi Group, eventually co-authoring the international bestseller and James Beard Award shortlisted book, Sweet, with YOTAM OTTOLENGHI. Born in Malaysia and having honed her craft in the vibrant culinary scenes of Melbourne, she now calls London home. But she isn't just a master of dough and sugar, she is also a trained psychologist, bringing a unique perspective to why we create, why we share, and how we find solace in the kitchen. Her latest work, Comfort, arrived in late 2024 to critical acclaim. And today, Dean and our guest look forward to her upcoming solo debut, a book that explores the profound connection between the oven and the soul, titled Baking and the Meaning of Life: How to Find Joy in 100 Recipes. Sit back as Dean Jones welcomes the brilliant chef Helen Goh.
Welcome to the podcast. Today we're speaking with chef, author, Helen Goh. Helen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Dean. Such a pleasure to be here.
Helen, I'm thrilled to have you here, and you've had such a journey from Malaysia to Australia and eventually to the heart of now London. How do these early sensory memories of Malaysia still find their way into your kitchen today?
I think so much of it is subconscious. Growing up in Malaysia, the scent, the fragrance of the street, it's so intense and vivid and flavorful and colorful. And although London isn't quite like that, every now and then, an ingredient from that will permeate through what I'm working on. So pandan, which we call vanilla of the East, that's the way that Malaysians infuse their food with flavor. Sometimes I think, well, maybe I won't use a vanilla bean. I'll use a pandan instead, a blade of pandan. It's like a grass. And sometimes I feel, if I'm working with caramel and I think, oh gosh, to put an accent on it, maybe I won't use salt caramel this time. I mean, it's a lovely flavor, but maybe I want to add a spoonful of tamarind in it. So it creeps in. I don't think of it so consciously as wanting to add something from my background, but every now and then I long for a flavor or I long for a memory of my childhood, and it does sneak in ways like that.
I want to ask because I have a special interest in this. For 20 years I was a librarian in a psychological school. So I was very fascinated to find out that you were a practicing psychotherapist while also making waves in the Melbourne food scene. Do you find that baking and therapy share a common goal, perhaps a search for comfort or order?
For a long time, I didn't. For a long time, I kept those two practices very separate. They were like two parallel train tracks that were never going to meet. And that was because partly that they served different parts of me. One was very physical and creative, and the other one was sort of more cerebral and analytical. And I needed them both to sort of feel whole or satisfied. And the other reason I kept them separate was because I wanted desperately to be taken seriously, by my patients and by the chefs in the kitchen. And with my patients, I think I was afraid. I was nervous of them finding out that maybe I didn't spend my time, going to lectures and reading books on psychotherapy, but actually I was cooking or reading recipe books. And in the kitchen, I was concerned that the chefs maybe wouldn't take me as seriously. I mean, it was all in my head. I'm sure that we have a multiplicity of within us. We're not just one thing or another. And I guess it was just sort of my youth. Well, not I wasn't that young, but it was a lack of experience and maybe insecurity that made me keep them very separate. And it was just when I came to write this book that I realized that there was a lot more in common than I thought. Both are very attentive processes. You really do need to kind of be quite present with both of those practices. And there's something about that process that's important. You know, when you're with a patient, it's that process, how they're saying it, what they're saying, how it's unfolding. And actually, likewise with baking, that process of the minute to minute attentiveness to that process can make the difference between, you know, something turning out really well and not. So psychology, I think, gave me the language to tap into the insights of not just the recipes in baking, but the emotional side of it. And I think when I started to write about to write baking and the meaning of life, those things really welled up in a way that, you know, I tried so hard to keep them separate, and it was actually terrific. It was a kind of coming out that finally I was sort of integrating, you know, those two parts of me. So it was a great experience to do that, to come out and acknowledge that.
Many of our listeners will know you from your incredible decade-long collaboration with YOTAM OTTOLENGHI. How did that partnership influence your culinary voice as you begin to think about striking out on your own?
That's a very good question. Um, I mean, I was already quite experienced by the time I joined Ottolenghi, but one of the things that I was very struck by was the boldness. I mean, as soon as I walked into the store, it was like an Aladdin's cave. You know, it was unapologetically colorful, unapologetically flavorful, unapologetically large, you know, the abundance. And I think I was probably more reticent, and that brought me out. You know, it made me, it gave me the courage. You know, you're not whispering with these ingredients, you're really having a full blown conversation. Um, you know, I just remember, you know, making a salad and chopping herbs. You know, I was used to putting, you know, 2 teaspoons of herbs, but this was 2 bunches of herbs. You know, the herbs were an ingredient. It wasn't just a little accent like I'd thought of in the past. So in that way, you know, it made me bolder, more courageous, more colorful. But as I was coming out of the collaboration with Ottolenghi, I mean, we're still very good friends and I'm still very connected to them. But when I was looking at going solo, what came up for me was that I was more tuned into a back to the restrained, back to the feeling of comfort, back to the feeling of tenderness and comfort, whereas Ottolenghi was sort of, you know, more outward looking, more bold. I was suddenly more tuned into the interiority of things. How did something make me feel? What did I want to convey by making this? Uh, it gave me, I guess, the space to retreat a little bit and to think about what was really meaningful for me. So I asked myself different questions. And at Ottolenghi, as a recipe developer, some of my questions might be, you know, how do I make this pop? How do I make this more interesting? How do I make this more, how can I be more clever with this? Whereas the questions I was now asking myself was, who am I feeding? What do they like? What might move them? In what context would this really sit well? You know, so while my cooking and my technique remains more or less the same, asking myself different questions steered me into slightly different directions.
I want to talk about your new book. Your new book is called Baking and the Meaning of Life.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk a little bit about this? And it has more than 100 recipes that I really enjoyed going through. You know, I had some particular favorites. I kind of was impressed that, you know, some of this stuff is very homey and some of it is very elegant. Like I'll mention the champagne and blackcurrant celebration cake, which is just sounds like wow. And then you have a lot of, you know, some really cute homey things like vanilla cupcakes, and things like that. Can we talk about what you are thinking of when you originally considered the concept for your cookbook and kind of that road to completion?
I'll start with the title, which I know sounds very grandiose. And when I was a psychology student, I devoured the books by Irvin Yalom, the New York psychoanalyst. And he wrote a book called Mama and the Meaning of Life. And my interpretation of his novels and books were that it was about the ordinary moments that stitched together make an extraordinary life. And I was very struck by that, and how baking, there's something resonant with baking, that all those small little cakes, not so much the big celebration cakes, but all the small little things that you make for people day to day, that if you stitch that together, that creates something, that creates a repertoire worth having. And I started very much with my own life. And, I'm glad that you mentioned that there's both the sort of plain everyday offerings, and then a kind of celebratory showstopper cake like the blackcurrant and champagne cake. And that's because I think for me, when I look at my life and all the little things that I've baked for friends or family for occasions big and small, all that stitched together, it's what's made my life meaningful. All the people I've baked for, all the occasions I've baked for, the people I wanted to send a little cake to say get well, or the person whose wedding cake I made, all those things added up for me to that meaningful life. So the title was, references Yalom in that way, but also captures the reality of my day to day, which is that I sometimes, need something quick. That there's a cheesy pita crisp there. I might buy a dip and make, a stack of those pita crisps. That's something I do quite often, but it's also punctuated by celebratory moments I want to mark, and also all those moments in the calendar, like Thanksgiving. There's a nut tart in there. It's a kind of pecan tart, but it has some figs in it because I wanted a chewy texture in there, not just nutty. And I think rituals and traditions are very important because they ground us in life. It's very daunting to think of this sort of year ahead, but if we can mark them into sections like Easter is coming up, or Thanksgiving, or Eid, or Chinese New Year, somehow, we locate ourselves in time and in place according to these rituals and traditions of baking. And I just love that. So included in the book are those moments, that help us to mark time.
This is your first solo book, but you recently worked on Ottolenghi's cookbook suite. Did you
Mhm.
feel a different kind of creative freedom, or perhaps a different kind of pressure when putting your own name on the cover of this book?
Mm. Yes and no. That's the short answer. Yes, because when you work as a team, there's so many voices, and it's a real collaborative process at Ottolenghi. We have the luxury of more or less staying with your specialty. So my specialty was developing recipes. Someone else who's perhaps more tuned into the minutiae might be testing the recipes to make sure that a quarter teaspoon of salt really is a quarter teaspoon. Another person might be more attuned to the words and may be able to sort of keep an eye on the flow of the recipe, when the way it's written. So it's quite luxurious because you get to kind of stay in your lane, but then it's also deeply collaborative. We test all the recipes together, we talk very often, and the recipes are passed between each other, in a very dynamic kind of process. So that's wonderful, but it can also sometimes take a long time to find your own compass. It can dull your voice a little bit because you're having to sort of consider so many other voices. And so that was quite liberating to not do that, to not have that, to be able to kind of really tune into yourself and what you really want to say with a recipe. But of course, on the flip side of that is that you're now completely responsible for that recipe.
Yeah.
And you have to, your name's on it, and you've got to stand by it. So it has both of those qualities and processes for me, both sort of daunting and liberating.
As a librarian, I loved that you had kind of a somewhat of a focus on community. You had items that were shareable treats for things like charity bake sales. Why the social solidarity of baking? What is that such a central theme for you in your writing?
It is, although I'll come to another a kind of flip side of that in a minute. But it is because generally, when you bake a cake, it's very rarely for yourself. There's usually
Right.
a relationship around it. There's usually a context around it. And what I find, especially, with my children, there's always a bake sale at school. And in fact, one of the seminal experiences I had while writing, well, when I thought I was going to write this book, was a charity bake sale for a fundraiser for it was in 2023, and it was the earthquake in Turkey. And the baking community in London came together with this idea of raising funds to send to the British Red Cross for the victims of this disaster. And we all turned up with lots of food, and we were all buying each other's foods, and sending more money to the British Red Cross. And when my husband was waiting for me in the car, he'd driven me because I was, had stacks of cupcakes and jalapeno muffins and
Ooh.
to drop off. And when I got back in the car, he said to me, he's a bit of a numbers man, and he said to me, "That's just such an inefficient way of raising money. I mean, wouldn't it be better if you all donated £10 each?" And I thought, well, that's true, but there was something about dropping off those bakes and seeing the community of people, not just the bakers, but the community of Londoners coming together in solidarity for this cause. It was like we were all doing something for a cause larger than ourselves. And that whole spirit of community, whether it's a kind of bake sale at my children's school, or a picnic, or a fundraiser, it brings people together in a way. I mean, you could say that all food does in a way, but there's something about the idea of baking. No one needs to eat a cupcake, or a scone. We don't need these baked goods for survival, I guess, apart from bread. And it's that very inessentiality that makes it special, because why do we do it? There's another reason. It's what it symbolizes. The symbolic thing can be anything from "I thought of you, I made this" to "let's share." And I think this that it a shareable cake for me is just enlarges upon life for me. And so the flip side of that is that when I began to think of this, and I think it's true that very few of us bake just for ourselves. When we bake a cake, we're usually thinking, who is it for? What do they like? When shall I give it to them? When do I make it? But there are instances of people like me who are devoted bakers who cook for the mastery of baking, who like the process of it, and who are trying to master the craft, and to learn something along the way. And I think that can also give life a lot of meaning. So you'll find that there's a chapter in the book called Learning, Growth and Achievement, because I think that can really give life meaning, whether you're learning to fly an aeroplane or bake something better in the kitchen. It can motivate and animate your life in that way. Yes, now I'm wondering if I answered your question.
No, you totally did. I wanted to circle back to the flavors we were talking about earlier, because you have some things in your book that I thought were very kind of jaw dropping. For instance, chocolate tahini cake with sesame brittle, pandan and coconut chiffon cake. And then I was really intrigued by the entries that I did not expect, which were the savory items, which I thought had an extra pop of flavor, like a puttanesca galette with lemon ricotta, wow, and potato garlic and rosemary focaccia. I was just like wowed by these. Can we talk a little bit about what you thought about going into this and how you kind of handled the aspect of flavor in these, taking these things kind of the extra mile?
Right, yes. One of the things I learned from doing this book, because I'm quite an impatient person by nature, is this idea of, well, it was actually from reading Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird. You know,
Yes.
in the beginning, I very much wanted a fully formed idea before I went into the kitchen. And then I would have this crashing disappointment when something didn't work, you know? And this bird, reading bird by bird, I read it actually in mind for writing my own book, because as I mentioned before, Ottolenghi, we have editors and, you know, people to look over it and to smooth over the edges of writing. And I knew with this one, you know, it was all on me. And I read bird by bird with this idea of how could I write more efficiently, write better. And actually it not only helped me with that, it gave me something else, which was in the kitchen with recipe development. Start with a shitty first draft. Start with one imperfect first draft. And when I did that, it was just amazing, the process unfolding. So I might start, let's say I wanted to do a savory galette. I had in mind that there were people, some strange people who don't eat sweets and cakes. And I thought, and I have some friends who don't do that. And I thought I wanted to bake some savory things for them too. It started off my wanting to do that. And my husband it's one of those people, and he loves puttanesca pasta. And I thought, how can I incorporate that into a bake? And I thought a galette, you know, a kind of rustic cake, nothing too fancy, something that looks homey and that I could sort of bake up for him. And when I started to put it together, I started with the flavor of the flour in the galette, which is a whole wheat flour, which gave it a nutty texture. I wanted something crumbly, but also very, very tasty. And there's olives, capers, anchovies, tomato, you know, all those flavors. And it really popped. And then I thought, you know, it was a little too acidic and aggressive. So I thought, what can I add to mellow it? And so I thought, oh, ricotta, little blobs of ricotta would sort of give you that mild, creamy relief. But then when I put the ricotta on, I thought, well, now it's too much of a contrast. That's now sort of bland pops with, you know, these very tasty, pungent ingredients like anchovies and capers. And then I thought, actually, what if I flavored it with a bit of lemon to give it some flavor? And then actually, what if I mash an anchovy and added it in? And then suddenly it offered creamy relief, but also very flavorful. So it was that acceptance that it was an iterative process, that I wasn't going to get it from one, you know, idea from the beginning, that it was being patient, trusting that actually if I just keep doing that next version and a version and to taste it and to bring myself to it, I will eventually get to that place where something is more balanced. And I absolutely love savory baking. I think that there's a rusticity to savory baking that is a permission to kind of throw something together. For me, I start with the same thing. So the flour, I consider, you know, the butter and eggs and ingredients that matter in sweet baking. And then I think about, well, I guess the flavor that I want to achieve and the occasion. For me, savory baking is about, I start with the occasion in mind. Is it a picnic? Is it a brunch? Or is it a little kind of afternoon, you know, treat, you know, like a little something to have with drinks? You'll see that a very unusual cake in there is called the pear parmesan cake. Pear parmesan. It has it's actually a savory cheesecake. It's made predominantly of Parmesan cheese, but I have pears on top. That was inspired by my time in Tuscany. I'm not very well traveled, but wherever I traveled, I make the most of it in terms of tapping into the food. And one of the things that I really enjoyed in Tuscany were the wine tastings. Not because it wasn't just wine tasting. Usually they would bring out a chunk of Parmesan or Pecorino and a slice of pear, and you were kind of drinking and eating together. And the combination of that nutty Pecorino and the pear, the sweet pear and the hazelnuts and everything, it just was such a revelation to me. And I saw Sophie Grigson, who's a British writer. She had a Parmesan cake, and I looked at that idea and I thought, that's sort of halfway to what we were eating in those vineyards. And what was missing for me was the little bit of honey and the pear, the little bit of sweetness to counteract. And I'm just absolutely thrilled that after several tests, that worked absolutely perfectly for me in terms of a little slice to have with drinks before dinner. And I'm very proud of that recipe. It sounds a bit wacky, but it really works. And I think savory bakes are just, you know, it has to be very flavorful, because usually it's just this sort of something to tide you over or to whet your appetite. And I love the premise of that.
In the book, you discuss the how and the why of baking, which I thought was really wonderful. For the novice baker who is intimidated by the scale and the whisk, which I often am, I'll admit that, what is the meaning they should look for in their first, perhaps imperfect cake?
I think it should be less about the idea of competence, because I think a lot of people are afraid of baking because they tell themselves they're not competent. I think the focus should shift from competency to relationships. Why am I making this? What do I want? Who do I want to share this with? What do I want to convey? And that actually, it doesn't have to be perfect. You're not trying to show that you are brilliant. You're not trying to show that you are precise and organized. You're trying to show that you are thinking of this person and you want to make this thing and you want to share it with them. Um, I I think imperfect. I'm slightly balk at hearing myself say this, because for many years, decades, in fact, I lived by this idea of perfecting something, and now I'm much more tuned in to. Winnicott in the psychology realm would say the good enough mother. I'm more tuned into being the good enough baker, and obviously for to write a book, I have to be more than a good enough baker. But in terms of the everyday, what can I put on the table that will just be good enough to get people together, rather than getting myself in an anxiety frenzy of trying to make something perfect, and then I'm in a bad mood by the time I sit down. you know so and also it's a process. It's like starting to learn a language like French. You don't suddenly speak in full sentences. You learn words, so you might start with something very simple. In the book I mentioned before, these pita crisps. It's just pita bread that's kind of separated into two thin pieces and then grated cheese over. It's incredibly delicious. The texture and the lightness of it. Maybe start with that. Look through the book to see that's something that speaks to you, rather than being, what can I do to impress somebody? What does it actually speak to me internally? What animates me?
There's so many wonderful things in the book. I just wanted to ask, just because this is something that always I think about all the time. When
Hmm.
you're at home in London with your family, what is the one recipe from this book, or maybe a couple of recipes from the book, that
Hmm.
your family asks for again and again?
Oh gosh, that's very easy actually, because almost every weekend I would make the Dutch baby. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I love them.
right.
It's kind of like
It's just
almost like a uh, it's there's similar things like a popover or
yeah,
things like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. It's like a giant Yorkshire pudding. And in the book, I have a sweet one and a savory one. And I initially worked on the sweet one because my children love to have their friends over for a sleepover. And usually they wake me up early because they're excited to wake up and hang out. And I'm there flipping crepes and pancakes while they're getting more and more impatient, and they're fighting over who's having the first one. And then I thought, well, actually, this giant popover, that it's so magical. It's so easy. The batter is made in a matter of minutes, and then it goes into the oven in one big skillet, and it comes out gloriously puffed up. And I sometimes call it the tear and share pancake, because I put the whole thing on the table and they have their jam, sometimes Nutella, sometimes a chocolate sauce, and they're tearing and sharing. And it both solves the problem of my, flipping pancakes one, after another, but it also, the joy that it brings to that table when they're literally tearing at this pancake and at the table, that is just so fun and joyous. So I love it for that reason. But when I was making that, there were some leftovers, and it had been sitting on the table for a while, and it was sort of 10:30 by the time I came to the scraps of it. And I ate it with a piece of mortadella and thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So then I created a savory version, and it has a little bit of parmesan in the batter itself. And and when it comes up all puffed up and glorious, I put some cheese at the bottom, and I put some mortadella, and then to give it a bit of contrast, I'll add some dressed rocket leaves on top. And the amazing thing is that it slices so neatly like a pie. You'll see the picture in the book. It slices just like a pie, like it would be quiche. So it's all kind of sort of crusty and crispy on the edges, but then there's a sort of custardy middle. And for me, it's a lovely contrast and a lovely brunch dish that I like to serve.
I love that. For our listeners, could you just give one thing maybe you want them to take away from the book Living Well that you kind of would hope that would kind of give an impression to them?
I think I mentioned before, it's this idea of not focusing on in fact, it was my process exactly that I shifted from, how can I be a clever baker to what do I want people to feel when I make this? So my takeaway would be, again, referencing the title, it's the ordinary moments, stitched together that make an extraordinary life. So that one thing that isn't a huge showstopper of a cake, but, the little muffin that you make, or the cupcake, or the little scone, or the blueberry loaf cake, all those things add up to something special, and that's why I tell the story in the book, not so much to be indulgent, I hope, but more to convey that over the course of many years, these small little things that I've baked for somebody, whether it's because they're recovering from chemotherapy and they want a little moment on their day to have a cup of tea with, those moments count. Those moments matter. When you show up with a little something, that matters.
I love that. Helen, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I want to
Thank you
remind.
so much, Dean. It was such a joy and just terrific questions. It's got me thinking, actually.
I want to urge everybody to go out and get the cookbook. It's at all better bookstores. We also have links in the podcast memo to purchase the book as well. I just want to remind everybody of that. Helen, lovely talking to you. I hope I get a chance to talk to you again.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on your show, Dean.
You've been listening to a conversation between Dean Jones and Chef Helen Goh, right here on the Well-Seasoned Librarian. If today's discussion sparked a craving for something sweet or perhaps a bit of soul-searching, you can find Helen's newest book, Baking and the Meaning of Life: How to Find Joy in 100 Recipes, available now at your favorite local bookstore or through the links in our show notes. While you're there, be sure to check out the links for her previous acclaimed works, including Sweet and Comfort, both co-authored with YOTAM OTTOLENGHI. They are essential additions to any baker's bookshelf. We'd like to thank Helen for sharing her journey from the clinics of psychology to the pastry kitchens of London with us today. For more episodes, recipe reviews, and interviews with the world's most fascinating culinary voices, visit our website or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. On behalf of Dean Jones and the entire team, thank you for joining us. And as always, we will see you in the library.